Cinema is easily the most advanced form of human communication and discussion. Although I'm not much of an expert with critiquing films in as much as making them or watching them, being self-taught, I tend to hyperfixate on certain niches, whether that be from users like Good Bad Flicks, Shallow 15 Productions, The Critical Drinker, Colin Looks Back, Bullets and Blockbusters, or The Greek Informant, mostly behind the scenes, the drama surrounding a film, and the deviations of said film. Oftentimes, the original concept sounds far better than the final product, this applying to hundreds of films that the general public will most likely never see the real thing. Gigli is one of those. Gigli became a commercial and critical failure when it first came out, mostly at the hands of greedy studio execs. The film was created for Revolution Studios at the beginning of the company's transition to star vehicles driven by filmmakers. Founder Joe Roth had a plan to produce roughly 6 movies for release every year through Sony, provided that their budgets were kept under $50 million. When Sony had a commercial comeback in 2002, the studio encouraged a more expensive slate the next year, but was forced to cut their losses following a number of expensive underachievers, such as the aforementioned Gigli. Film director Martin Brest, who had a source of steady profits from Going in Style, Beverly Hills Cop, Midnight Run, the Oscar-nominated Scent of a Woman, and loose remake of Death Takes a Holiday, Meet Joe Black, was permitted to write, produce, and direct Gigli with a budget of $54 to $70 million. Despite being advised not to go above the allocated budget, Brest persisted anyway. But before we go any further, here's a bit of some background information. Writer-director Martin Brest claims that Gigli was connected to his past films on a theatrical level. He often wrote characters with one of two sides. The central character who superficially comes off as generally mean, angry, and unsympathetic, yet over time is forced to put on that facade to protect oneself. The most important thing, quote, was to create a central character who is stuck in time, who has somehow missed the opportunity to grow and progress, unquote, according to Brest. Throughout the story, Larry Gigli surprises himself by revealing aspects of his personality that he had previously thought he was. This would emphasize in the film's gallows humor, when he and other characters are flipped out and caught up in whatever unfortunate circumstances, quote, which turns funny when a certain insight emerges. That's the kind of observation we were always looking for, unquote. Affleck was written in mind based on his physical presence but also vulnerability. The rest of the story's development hinged on Ricky, a character Gigli encounters during his kidnapping assignment, who invokes him and gives him a fresh perspective by her radically different sensibility and approach to life. Brest wanted somebody beautiful, sexy, and strong, but with a soft side. Haley Berry was originally cast, but when she dropped out due to a schedule conflict, she was recast with Jennifer Lopez. The producer, Casey Silver, remarked the chemistry Affleck and her had together, even if critics were harsh on it later on. Ben's Larry Gigli is a nuanced character whose brash demeanor masks his truer feelings, whereas Jennifer's character Ricky has her own secret and also wisdom that allows her to see through Larry's exterior persona. This dynamic creates an escalating tension that ultimately breaks down each character's defenses and portends a more hopeful future, unquote. Casting opposite of the two was Justin Bartha as Brian, the mental handicap, whom the actor studied his role based on working at the Bronx State Hospital in college. Lainey Kazan, off My Big Fat Greek Wedding, one of my mother's favorite films, by the way, was cast as Gigli's mother. Christopher Walken was cast as Detective Stanley Jacob Ellis, and Al Pacino, who previously worked with Brest and won an Oscar on Scent of a Woman, was cast as the mobster Starkman. The film was shot over the spring and summer of 2002 across Los Angeles and sound stages at Culver Studios, where Larry's apartment was built. Once filming wrapped and went into post, the film ran about 2.5 hours. As per contract, Brest had final cut on the condition the film was under 2 hours, but because it ran over, Revolution forced him to recut it. Post-production shut down for 8 months while the film underwent test screenings. Brest clashed with Roth over the film's tone, pace, and third act, so much so he had to be physically separated from a producer after the studio's version scored the same as his darker original version. The film underwent 5 weeks of reshoots, ballooning the film's budget, and re-edits that compressed the criminal plot in favor of the romance built around its 2 stars. Sony also juggled the idea to retitle the film as Tough Love, figuring most moviegoers would mispronounce the title, but never did. Although the story bears some romance, it wasn't particularly made as a romantic comedy, rather a sad, awkward, but ironic tale about a man pretending to be someone he isn't and wanting to leave the mob, but in the midst of which accidentally forming a family with 2 people just as lost as he is. Something a blank slate like myself could relate to. Gigli was made to be a slow-burn mobster film, but ultimately tailored and molded to meet the tabloid image of Bennifer. All it did was please nobody, essentially kill 2 birds with 1 stone. It was the ultimate punching bag for those who got tired of Bennifer, and it robbed the film of much of its quirky appeal. Brest disowned it and was out of work, claiming it had been changed so radically that it left him with a, quote, ghastly cadaver of a movie, unquote. Today, the film is a hotly debated topic that often divides opinion. Fans who love it, others who hate it, and those that say it's a near miss. I, on the other hand, am interested in this alternative version that could have been. Sense of how much time has passed and no footage nor new home media release has surfaced aside from articles as well as clips you can find online, whether that be in the trailers and in the featurette. The only way to see it is through the original script. Believe it or not, I personally had it in my possession via eBay and sealed up in a laptop zip-up bag before scanning it and posting it to the Internet Archive. For copyright reasons, I'm not going to show any clips from either source here, but you can refer to the links in the description. So with that, sit back as we go along with Gigli's script to screen. The script opens with Gigli extorting a man at a laundromat for his superior Lois. He leaves the laundromat with the money and heads down the street. Stopping at a corner, he shuts his eyes and pictures himself on a picturesque beach. He takes it in before shutting his eyes and opening them again, now back on the street. He trudges onward. The script follows beat to beat with Larry meeting up with Lois, who gives him the order to kidnap Brian, going to the adult daycare center, lures Brian away with the promise of going to the Baywatch, foils him with a flashlight as a phone, in the script as a eyeglass case, takes him to his apartment, Ricky showing up, disagreements between parties, Larry asking the ambiguous Ricky where she's been, what she does, saying that she doesn't look like a contractor, and so on. The next day, Detective Jacob Ellis stops by Gigli's apartment talking about Starkman and the fact that his brother has been absconded with. There's more to do with his character later in the script rather than this one-off scene in the theatrical cut, specifically his offhand comment about Marie Callender's. The trio then hit up a taco stand where Ricky talks her way out of a confrontation between some high schoolers using Tai Mo Chang, although much of which seems pointless in the theatrical cut actually has some more meaning to it later on. They stop at Larry's mother's house, wherein the conversation is elongated with some background on Larry's upbringing. She once had a husband, Tommy, with the same last name as his son, and Larry got picked on at school for it, which kind of shaped his combative personality. The yoga monologue, phone call from Lois to cut off Brian's thumb, Ricky's girlfriend bursting in and self-harming herself over Ricky's supposed affair, going to the hospital to cut off a corpse's thumb, and getting the proper packaging for it plays beat for beat. The trio head back on the road and come up to a stoplight, talking on about Chinese philosophy. Another car honks behind him as the light is turned green and he's stopped in the lane. With a baseball bat in hand, Larry confronts him on Eastern philosophy regarding existence and time. He smashes up the car's windows, then gets back in and speeds off, leading him into the Dicosaurus Rexi monologue about his feelings and insecurity. Ricky compliments him. Back at the apartment, the two consummate, hence it's turkey time. Jacobella stops by afterward where the two talk. He rambles on about things in his personal life, stress, constipation, mental health, other things, basically oversharing to build some weird emotional leverage, essentially probing Gigli, testing him and trying to assert control while pretending it's friendly, before turning passive-aggressive when he accuses Gigli of hiding something. He eventually leaves. A shaken-up Larry tries to get Ricky to be his girlfriend, but then decides to talk about it another time. The next day, Larry gets a call from Lois for him and Ricky to meet up with Starkman, but not to bring the thumb, which they already mailed out. Larry and Ricky head out, leaving Brian at the condo. While waiting in the car, Gigli shares with Ricky about his fantasy to go someplace clean, hence the picturesque beach established early on. There's mention of it in the theatrical cut, whereas the script's version, it makes more sense. Lois pulls up and says that Starkman has arrived. They go to his house, which plays beat for beat. Starkman never approved the kidnapping scheme, the severed thumb wasn't Brian's own, how the situation was mishandled, and him killing Lois. He turns on Larry and Ricky, preparing to do the same, when Ricky talks him out of it by saying that they didn't actually cut Brian's thumb, and that they know where he is and can keep him quiet. After a taxi ride back, Larry, Ricky, and Brian pack up and head for the road, leaving much of Larry's other belongings behind. Larry gets a call from Jacobella saying he wants to talk and ends up hanging up. They pull off to the side of the road for a while, then continue on, passing along a commercial shoot which Brian claims to be the Baywatch. He begs Larry and Ricky to stop so they can go, but tells them they'll have to go later. They make another detour to Larry's mother's house, where the two have a conversation about where Larry's heading off to. When heading out, Jacobellis appears and punches Larry in the gut. They talk about Starkman and asks him for Brian before he leaves. Later on, Ricky lays into Larry about how she's not really a contractor, much to his chagrin. This follows on from specific points such as when they first meet, and her insistence on talking her way out of sticky situations. She claims to be named Rochelle and a former musician. The actual hit woman is revealed to be her girlfriend, Robin. The two had problems, and as an escape, Rochelle tried to taste what Robin's life was like, hence her showing up on Larry's doorstep. She also took a paycheck from Lois to help her start afresh after all would be said and done. Having had her taste of things and bearing witness to the death of Larry's higher-up, she tries to get Larry to pick up and leave with her. He declines, and Rochelle takes her things, leaving him and Brian behind. Before she goes, she tells Larry he could still turn his life around and urges him to go do what's right, turn Brian in. After a stopover at Pink's Hot Dogs, Larry gives Jacob Ellis a call for them to meet up. Larry brings Brian to an abandoned building where Detective Jacob Ellis is waiting. Jacob Ellis goes on about being a cop and how Larry and him are alike. He reveals that he's been working with Starkman, implying that both he and Larry are bound by silence and complicit in filthy labor, a notion that Gigli rejects. Jacob Ellis and Larry engage in a brief gunfight. Jacob Ellis is shot dead by Larry, but not before being struck in the chest. Although in shock, he downplays his injury and feebly drives Brian back toward the Baywatch. The car drifts into the pavement markers momentarily, but Gigli pulls it back into his lane. They eventually pull off at the beach. After supporting himself on Brian's arm toward the set, Larry rests by a ridge and encourages the hesitant Brian to go have fun. At certain intervals early on in the condo, Brian talks with an Australian girl on the phone, and for here he ends up meeting a girl that looks like one. He strikes up conversation like Larry taught him earlier and eventually dances with her. Larry lies bleeding out in the sand, and a sandstorm picks up. The world around Larry slowly fades as the sand engulfs him. His gaze remains fixed out toward the ocean, his longed-for, clean place. Even if some naysayers say that the story is still bad, it does make all the difference to the jumbled mess that was the theatrical cut. Yes, it could have been tightened, and certain aspects such as the ableism could have been adjusted given the current political and social atmosphere than how it was pre-9/11, but it carries more bite and texture in places such as the thread with Larry's fantasy of a clean place that comes around in the end, Larry's mother reflecting on his upbringing, like the weight of his last name, and having more to do with the supporting characters like Jacob Ellis. When going over Martin Brest's tendency to write dual-natured characters, it's not hard to see how the studio imposed changes disrupted both the film and its character dynamics. For the script and trailer, he's a troubled man with a split personality with a hidden agenda, whereas in the finished film, that complexity collapses into inconsistency. He swings between a loud one-note gangster yelling back and forth with no real emotional through line, and suddenly becoming squeamish, with little justification and synthesis bridging the two. And whose undoing was that? The studio execs. As mentioned before, while the story contains romantic elements, it was never fundamentally built as a romantic comedy, and that becomes even clearer when you factor in how compromised the final product feels. It still has its quirks and occasional charm, but it likely would have benefited far more from preserving Brest's original cut rather than reshaping it into the film it is. At best, you could argue for tightening, folding exposition from bits of the script more organically into existing scenes, but the larger issue isn't excess, it's interference. Other members of the crew argue about Brest's work ethic, such as Affleck and the cinematographer Robert Elstwit, who, although enjoyed his time with Brest, he was generally not a good screenwriter. He cites Brest's decision in writing his own film led to a poorly made movie, which was further exacerbated by messy personal dynamics on set, his inability to compromise, and his personality, especially his combative relationship with the studio execs on the changes imposed on him. All in all, it's interesting to see how the original cut could have been. The theatrical cut is the same as the shooting script, just with a different third act. I'd like to see a future release of the director's cut if possible, but since there's no demand a la Justice League, most likely it will never be. Who knows if the studio still has it? Whatever it may be, this is all there is. Better to live a series of oh wells than what ifs.